I met Professor Surak in London in January of this year. Many of us from the region, well, some of our leaders, prime ministers, were there along with a few of us, including myself, meeting with the UK government, who invited us along with the European Commission and the US to discuss this very thing, citizenship by investment, CBI or CIP. And I was curious because I found out she was one of the very few persons in the world who was actually studying this program, a program that means so much to us in the region, and for many of our countries, as you have pointed out, a lifeline. How did you get into this? How did you get into this industry? Of all the things you study, you were in Japan for a while, you speak fluent Japanese. Why CBI?
Well, my initial research was on the Japanese tea ceremony, which means you get to go to beautiful places, eat delicious food, and have a wonderful time at the center of Japanese hospitality. And I thought, what other kind of research project can you do that allows you to go to beautiful places, eat delicious food, and enjoy some wonderful hospitality? And it turned out to be this. But to be honest, it was, so it is strange that, I'm a Japanologist. I started off and I came across a wonderful research area. But part of it was I was doing work on labor migration. And Malta started its Citizenship by Investment program. And, I saw it in the news or whatever, and I thought this is kind of interesting vis-a-vis labor migration. And I went to one of these conferences around it, and I realized, everybody's saying it's just cash for passports, but it's like, no, there's so much more going on here. It's a really complex phenomenon, really complex industry. There's a lot of different, parts to this, and a lot of moving pieces. And what I thought would initially be the final chapter of a book on temporary labor migrations around the world turned out to be a whole book in and of itself that has taken about 10 years to produce. There's just so much that I think, in the region, it's got a particular significance, but I think there's so much we can learn about the world and learn about globalization through this lens as well.
Thank you. And I want to thank you on behalf of the region for coming to this enterprise with an open mind and not prejudging us and coming with a philosophical position that these programs are wrong, immoral, and ought not to be done. And we respect people who do not have programs. But as you pointed out, it is a lifeline for many of our countries. And you showed the numbers. The fact of the matter is that 75 cents of every non-tax dollar in our currency union now comes from CBI, CIP. 75 cents. And a lot of people don't see the programs, don't know what they fund, but they fund things all around us. You drive the Island Main Road in St. Kitts and Nevis, that's CBI. That's CBI. And I can go on and on through the islands. You go to Dominica and you see housing, that's CBI. And we can list them all. So there's a lot more that needs to be done about awareness. But from what you said, there is a future for this program, if I heard you correctly. And I'm asking you to speak to that for a moment, because there is some anxiety in the space about geopolitical shifts and what they portend for the future of this program. And what I heard you say, if I heard you clearly tonight, is that the desire for global mobility remains strong, and there is a future for these programs. They may have to be adapted, we may have to evolve, but there's a future. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, I think there's definitely demand, and that demand will continue to grow. I think if one compares the scene now to, say, 20 years ago, there's much more everyday knowledge about them. I spent half a year teaching at NYU Abu Dhabi, and this citizenship by investment was an everyday conversation. I would meet the spouses of my colleagues, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, of course, citizenship by investment." It was just simply, it was an area of the world that's like simply known and kind of taken for granted, and it's not seen as a really big deal. So I think as awareness of these programs spreads, it will increase. I think there's also been an increased interest, looking at the changes in the U.S. and especially post-COVID, more and more people who've come from countries that have traditionally been strong, politically stable, quote unquote, countries with quote unquote good passports or whatever, are suddenly thinking, how do I keep my options open? How do I live a more global life? So I found that to be an interesting shift as well.
You seem to suggest, Professor Surak, that we may be missing an opportunity. A lot of the initial focus has been on revenue collection, given the needs of our region or development needs. But you seem to suggest that there is a broader possibility to leverage these programs for development impact if we were to see these citizens as an economic diaspora.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's a complicated one, too. So I'm not an economist, and so questions about economic development, especially for small island developing states, it's not really the bread and butter of what I do as a sociologist. But what I find interesting in sociology, we talk about nation states, basically countries. There's this idea that the nation or the people are in the state that represents them, and that's how the world works. So if you look at a map of the world, it's a bunch of clear countries, clear borders, solid colors in between, and all of that. That's the nation state. The nation is in the state. When we think about the Caribbean and the Eastern Caribbean especially, these are diaspora nations in the first place. Probably every single person in this room has a family member in New York or Miami or Toronto or London. So these are diaspora nations by definition. There's a lot of CARICOM, inter-CARICOM mobility as well. And then when we think about investor citizens, most of whom are elsewhere in the world, it's interesting to think about this question of what is their attachment or connection to the country. Now, right now, investment, make your contribution, we make you a citizen, and for a lot of people that interest kind of ends there. But I know this too from talking with people involved in these programs. There's interest in seeing, can we make that into a bigger relationship? Can we make that into a bigger connection so that, for example, if you're to set up a hurricane relief fund, if you can get investor citizens after they became a citizen to donate to the country. Now, it's what I've seen in going around the world and talking to, wherever you go around the world, there'll be different attitudes and different expectations that people have. Investors in China will have a different set of expectations to investors in Dubai will have a different set of expectations to investors in the U.S., from the U.S., for example, as well. So where that will come or how people relate to that often has will depend on. But I do remember one time in my interviews, I spoke with a person who was Palestinian, who had been born stateless, grew up stateless, and became an investor citizen in the Caribbean. And when he was telling me about that, he was actually crying. He said he was so touched, to finally have that sense of security, and he felt a stronger connection to the country as well. A friend of a friend in London recently became a citizen in the Caribbean. She was saying that, it was basically she's highly educated, or she became a citizen, highly educated tech person from London, or based in London, from Russia, who all of her degrees were in the UK, so she's been able to get residence in London and all of that, but she was just saying she's thinking about it for her child and about the future, and she wants to go to the country and see it and be a part of it and, connect in some way. She's not going to move to the Caribbean, but she wants to, for her, it's just more than a one-off transaction. So there are some people like that in the world, and I think it's thinking about ways to develop the programs more. That's kind of an interesting population to think about. That is another part of the bigger diaspora.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, because for many, many decades, we've experienced brain drain, where we've lost critical skills. Some of the best minds of our region are helping the US and the UK and Canada, helping those countries. What we are looking for in this dispensation is a brain gain, where we get skills coming back into the region. Because I've always argued, remittances can never compensate for the loss of critical skills. As useful as remittances are, we will be much further along as countries if we had these skills at our disposal in our countries. Now, there are reasons why they've left, the opportunity, whatever, and so on. Went abroad, studied, children came, family, they stayed. But the reality is that we need those skills. And what I'm hearing you saying is that we have a real opportunity, if we focus on it, to tap some of these skills of persons, whether it's full-time or part-time, to help with our development enterprise. And that's something we need to be thinking about, because that takes us way beyond simply collection of fees at the point of grant of citizenship. Thank you, Dr. Surak. We're going to turn to our audience now to take some questions. So let's see who wants to go first. I'm also going to rely on our team to let us know if anybody's online in any of our member countries or online who wishes to pose a question as well. I see a young lady is making her way. Looks like a colleague of ours.
Good night, Dr. Surak. Okay, so my question is, as we talk about geopolitics, right? And we're living in a changing world. We're seeing like everything shift around us. We have this particular vantage point now where we could see things changing. We're seeing changes in the world order, economic shifts around the world, right? I have wondered, this is me personally, that beyond the individual principal motives that were highlighted, whether when we talk about citizenship by investment, there are like strategic power moves happening behind the scenes, where like countries that expose themselves to CBI are maybe chess pieces in a bigger scheme to influence global world power and how decisions are made and things like that. I've wondered that. And I'm wondering now, it doesn't have to be so impossible to believe, because now everything is so transparent. We're hearing about covert operations in Venezuela, biological warfare, all of these things. So in your research, whether or not beyond individuals having these reasons behind their wanting to invest, whether countries themselves are strategically positioning themselves by investing in these programs as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't seen so much of that. The only case I can think of is the case of Comoros, where there's a very large stateless population in many of the GCC countries. It's an interesting. I'm fascinated by citizenship and different citizenship regimes around the world. And there's very interesting histories, and the colonial history in GCC countries has a big impact on this kind of tiered forms of citizenship that they have. One of the upshots of that is that if you're a citizen, you get a lot of rents from the oil in terms of the government. You get free housing, you get free education, you get free medical care. It's great to be a citizen. It means that there's large stateless populations in these countries as well. And there's a great book by a journalist called Atusa Abrahamian.
Repeat that?
There's a book by a journalist, and her name is Atusa Abrahamian, and it's called Cosmopolites. And she writes about the Comoros case, where I think it was Kuwait and UAE, where the governments were getting passports from the Comoros to give to their stateless populations in the country to give them some sort of document. So that's the only case I can really think of at that level where you see countries kind of getting involved in a way where you're kind of like, oh, huh. But otherwise, not so much, to be honest.
Right. Thank you very much. Let's take another question, please. I see there's a student approaching the mic. Go right ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Dr. Surak. I know you said you're not an economist, but I heard you say your field of study is sociology. Sorry. Test. Sorry. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Tyler Maynard. I am representing the Washington Archibald High from 4A1. And as I said, I know you said you're not an economics. Your field of study is sociology. But I would like to know, St. Kitts as a small island state, how can we ensure that our citizenship by investment program continues to attract high-value investors without compromising our national security or the long-term sustainability of our economics, or our economy? My bad.
Yeah. Yep. That's the big question. That's exactly the question I was posing to you and asking, what does the region think in terms of its own benefit and risk assessment and whether it's worth it? So I don't want to step in and give answers or what I think of as answers. I think I can only talk about, sort of the trends and patterns that I've seen out there, and what countries need to be aware of in terms of, if they choose to have a program, how to structure it in order to make sure that it does the most to build a country as well. But those questions that you're asking are precisely the ones that I think, there needs to be a well-informed public discussion about. So we know, as I was showing, we know that for some of the governments, this has become an incredibly important revenue source. I didn't, and also thinking about what it means for the Eastern Caribbean dollar as well. Absolutely a huge important source. But, there's also risks. There's also, you want to have a country too that is livable and you're happy with, and it's a community that you feel a part of and all of that. And so, yeah, I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's what I'm hoping that kind of laying out the global scene in these, what I've studied can help inform how people here make their own decisions about that.
This again. If you would allow me to ask just one more question. I know you gave us the numbers, and I know you said that the delinquents and the criminals contribute a very negligent factor to the overall CBI investors. But my question was really pertaining to how can we ensure that our CBI program does not, influence or encourage criminal activities?
Yeah, that's a very important. Number one, there has to be very good due diligence background checks, making sure these are the right people. Right now in the Caribbean, there's more due diligence background checks for the programs in terms of how they really operate through the units on the ground than, for example, getting a student visa for the UK. The countries will run checks with Interpol, with the JRCC in CARICOM, with private due diligence companies that do background checks for banks as well, and there might be even another level. So making sure those are solid and making sure people don't go around that is really important, I think, for this question of, are these the right people? And I think, too, there's this, when one thinks about making sure that the money is coming into the country and being used in the best way also means you don't need to have a whole lot of approvals for it to make a real difference for the country. And, so this question of making sure they're the right people, one of the easiest way to do that is to keep a program small and tight and make sure those background checks are really solid. They're never going to be 100%. Nothing really ever is, but to make it as solid as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, youngster. I appreciate your questions. And let me add 2 quick points to that and leverage something you said earlier. And one of that is biometrics. So you made the point earlier, and I want to agree with you, that biometrics is going to be extremely important for us to take our due diligence to the next level. And in the agreement that is now being enacted in law, in fact, just to be clear, the CBI, the agreement to set up the regional regulator, the Eastern Caribbean Citizenship and Investment Regulatory Authority, has now gone to all 5 of our parliaments, has been passed into law in Dominica, St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, Grenada. It went to the lower house and was passed yesterday. It's going to the Senate tomorrow. So by the end of tomorrow, all 5 countries would have passed this legislation into law. We have to give our governments credit for that. In that law is a provision for biometrics. So to address what you said and to answer your question, student from Washington High, biometrics, iris fingerprints, will allow us, that's a gold standard now for identity. That's the gold standard. So one of the risks Dr. Surak mentioned was identity risk, where people can steal identities, pretend to be somebody they're not, hide identities, maybe change their name. With biometrics, you're going to really strengthen our ability to make sure that who you say you are is who you actually are. That is coming under this program with the provisions in that current law. So that's one example of how we're going to be strengthening the programs. I can tell you one other thing. Last week we met, we meaning all 5 countries with programs. ECCB was there, the US, the UK, EU, European Commission, and we had a discussion with the US about the biometrics program. And one of the things that came out of that meeting last week is that there'll be a study tour to the US because they have a biometrics lab in Virginia, which our teams will look at as we look to make sure that our biometrics program is compatible with whatever happens in the US, in the UK, and in Europe, so that there is compatibility, all intended to reduce the risk and make sure that there are no issues in terms of our ability to proceed around those concerns about identity risk, money laundering, and so on. We have a question online, so let's see if we could go quickly online, and then we could take maybe one in the room. Here's the question. How sustainable are CBI programs in the current global space, where small island states are subject to unfair attempts to derail and ultimately damage their economies under nefarious pretenses such as involvement in human trafficking?
It's an interesting question. I'm trying to understand whether who the actor is within this, whether the concern is about small islands being used by larger for example, human trafficking chains as stop-off places, and that actually doing damage to the reputation of the country, and then also in combination with citizenship by investment, more difficult, or using the citizenship by investment program as a tool in, for example, like something like human trafficking.
Well, just to say, just if I may assist, my read of the question, and I may be wrong, is that the pose of the question feels that we are up against it in the global community, that there's always a roadblock in our way, that something will be put there. Today it is money laundering, tomorrow it is narcotics, the next day is human trafficking.
Okay.
So the question is, can we survive if there is always some, they put it, nefarious pretense to hold us back?
Okay, so when I was doing this research, and there's actually quite a lot about it in the books, is the power politics of this space and the power politics of geopolitics in this space and the challenges that small island developing states face against bigger players with their own agendas and not a chance, on top of, and what can also start off with, I live in the UK, and of course the UK is one of the reasons why we have St. Kitts, and the UK paid reparations to slaveholders and not the people who were actually enslaved by them. So there's obviously a long, long history of this that hits countries in this region very, very hard. So what I find interesting in thinking about this, so I live in London right now. I'm in Europe, or ex-EU, unfortunately. My passport is not, my UK passport is not powerful like it used to be. But in Europe, there's a lot of assumptions that people carry about these sorts of programs, and those are very strong in the EU as well, and I see those all the time. But they're different in other parts of the world. So when I go to East Asia, people are really pragmatic. They're just like, oh yeah, of course, yeah, why not? Why wouldn't you do it? It's like they've got no issue in even talking about it. It's a completely different attitude. Dubai as well, people are like, oh yeah, of course, I saw it, see advertising, whatever. The US is also, I think, shifting as a lot more US citizens are thinking about, what are my exit options? Wait, suddenly, I want to get a passport, and so I can, be where I feel comfortable and safe. So I think, if you were to ask that question in Europe, you'd get one set of answers, but if you were to ask that question in other parts of the world, I think you'd get different answers. And so to really think about it, one can also think about what is over time, what will be the shift in power balance between the global north, or the North Atlantic countries, meaning Europe, US, and the rest of the world. And who knows? The role of the US is shifting quite a lot right now. South-South connections are being built up in ways people didn't expect, as well. The U.S. still has a particular hegemonic position because of the role of the U.S. dollar. But it'll be interesting to see how that changes and what that means for countries in the Eastern Caribbean and some of those, that longer history of roadblock after roadblock after roadblock being thrown up by actors that may in the future not be as important.
Very well. Thank you very much, Professor Surak. Could we get 2 more questions quickly? I see 2 students. Yes.
Good night, everyone. Good night. I am Kayla Penny, representing the Clarence Fitzroy Bryant College and the St. Kitts National Youth Parliament Association. Dr. Surak, you mentioned global mobility and inequality. Considering that some passports are valued far more than others, do you think citizenship by investment programs actually challenge the global hierarchy, or do they end up reinforcing it?
Oh, great question. You've got a lot of really smart students in this room. Thank you for these great questions. So I have colleagues who've written about the global passport hierarchy as well. It's not, and what I've seen in looking at the space and looking at demand is kind of 2 things. So the scholar Dmitry Kochanov will talk about a passport hierarchy. The scholar Yossi Harpaz will talk about strategic citizenship, and he's studied how people from low-income to middle-income countries will be much more strategic about citizenship opportunities than people from high-income countries. So, for example, if you're from Latin America and you move to the US, you naturalize as soon as you can because it's a more, it's a stronger citizenship to hold. Whereas if you're a US citizen and you're moving somewhere else, you tend to naturalize the moment you're going back home because you still want to have access to this place where maybe your kids are, where you still have connections and all of that. So it's a different level of kind of pragmatic thinking depending on where you were born, in effect, over which you've get no choice whatsoever. So some people are thinking about, how do I just, Yossi Harpaz would call it compensatory citizenship. How do I compensate for the fact that I was born in a country that's lower down on that hierarchy? I've also seen people, though, in my research, if you think about US citizens, it's about multiplying options. It's not about compensating for a lack. It's about just making sure the world remains my oyster, in effect. And so I think in that sense, you can see the citizenship, you can see this kind of hierarchy at work in 2 different ways. One you could say, reinforces it, and one kind of works within that kind of quote-unquote passport privilege. That's already there, just keeping things open. It's a great question.
Arigato.
You heard that?
That's
Of course you did. So for those who don't know, she just gave a little Japanese right there. Oh, you were very smart. Let's take 1 more. That's going to be, and then we'll take, those will be our last 2, please.
Good night, everyone. Dr. Surak, Governor. So my question, sorry.
You're going to speak a little louder, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, speak up, just.
Oh, okay. As I said, good night, everyone. Good night, Dr. Surak, Governor. My name is Mahesh Doro. I am a 5th form student from the Bastia High School. And my question is from a youth's perspective, as in how the CBI program can create more opportunities for the local youth in terms of scholarships, internships, and job placements.
Right. So opportunities for youth, scholarships, internships, and
job placements.
Right. Thanks for that. I'm going to take this question, and then I'm going to ask you to respond to both.
All right. Good evening. 1, 2. Test.
Yeah, we need some volume on this mic, please.
Test. 1, 2. All right. Good evening, everyone. I am Vicky Edwards Douglas from the Clarence Fitzroy Bryant College, and I am the SGA president. Now, I was dissecting the topic this evening with one of my friends, Ms. Williams, and we were looking at the presentation which spoke mostly to the CBI program in terms of the economic development and the benefits and the different things, as well as how can it be a danger in some cases. Now, my question mostly zooms in when it comes to the resilient aspect of the CBI program. So this is my question. In what ways can the deliberate cultivation of active, place-based citizenship transform the structural vulnerabilities of small island developing states from economic dependency to resilience? And does this suggest that nation building is as much a civic project as it is an economic one?
Great questions again. Okay. All right. So to the first one, I would just say, yeah, it would be great to see these programs doing much more of that sort of thing. And I think this is where, if you're going to have a program, this is where people, should be lobbying governments to say, okay, this is how we want to see it being used to develop the country. And this is, and in a way that it's not just a one-shot thing, but one that leads to greater resilience in the future. Because, and the IMF will always say this about the programs, these sudden stop effects. Because if the money stops, the program stops for whatever reason, then you're kind of left in the lurch. But ideally, the country would have built up some resilience so that it can actually, function without it. So, it can be seen as an opportunity, but it can be an opportunity only if it's used well. To this other question about, and I'm going to have to think about all the different parts in it as well. So this question of what's nation building, could you rephrase
Sure,
and make sure I get it right?
Sure. So in what ways can the deliberate cultivation of active, place-based citizenship transform the structural vulnerabilities of small island developing states from economic dependency to resilience? And does this suggest that nation building is as much a civic project as it is an economic one?
Okay, so this question of nation, and I say this because as a sociologist, my initial work was on nations and nationalism, and that creation of a national identity and how that works and what it's doing and all of that. So in a territorial place-based nation it's an interesting question to ask, though, for one of the things that has always struck me so much about the region, which is these are diaspora nations in many ways. Everybody has family all over. And the role of the family unit as an economic unit, where people are sending some money back or they're helping kids go to schools elsewhere, this sort of thing, this is kind of how a lot of families get by and how a lot of countries kind of in the region kind of work. So it's because they're less place-based in that sense in some ways, because everybody has family outside, and these family networks are really important. But the questions you're asking too about civic engagement, what does it mean to be here and build up a citizenry or a population around that? For me, it's a question where to be honest, I'm kind of cynical about nations, but I say that as a US citizen who always wanted to leave. And I'm happy being a foreigner. I like being an outsider, and I think that because I'm a sociologist, I want to understand, that problematizing of the world all the time is important for me. So this question of building a nation, you can rephrase the term nation to something like a population or a community. And if we think about the Eastern Caribbean as well, there's a lot of even inter-island mobility too. Substantial parts of the population are not, from there. But they might be an important civic part of civic life, an important part of the community. So it's this question of, there's this one thing of, quote unquote, building a society and what goes in and how people feel invested. I think especially in small places where you can know a lot of people and then, it's only a couple of degrees of separation, everybody on the island. That's one thing, and that's really important. The question of the role of economics, I think, has a lot more to do with the infrastructure state side of it. You can have a healthy, thriving community at that social level, but that question of what is the economic support and infrastructure will probably come in some way too. If there aren't good, if there isn't good medical access, if there isn't good roads, there isn't good education as well. So for me, maybe it's because I'm kind of an anti-American American that it's hard for me to answer this question, to feel really nostalgic about nations and national belonging, but I think community is really important in there.
All right,
Thank
thank
you
you,
very
Dr.
much.
Surak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Surak. Thank you very much, students, I'm sure. We have to end there because we have a very important item before we conclude that we must get in before the top of the hour. So we'll have to conclude now. But I'll tell you this. You see those questions that you raise? Those are questions that we have to answer in this region, not Dr. Surak. We who live here, that's for us. So these are excellent questions. We have to wrestle with them and answer them for ourselves. Because at the end of the day, this is our development. We appreciate her research and her commentary, but this is about us. We have to have those conversations. So excellent questions to be continued. And I will tell you, as we've been working on the regulator for the last year, a lot of these very important questions have come up. And we need to have those conversations. By the way, Sniper had an excellent contribution. Thank you very much. I want to take this opportunity. Thank you very much. When that law was put out, the draft for circulation, for comment, we got a lot of feedback, and Sniper, we were, very proud. You all did really well. Thank you very, very much. It makes us feel good about our future and our young people. Thank you. So, Dr. Surak, we will end it here. Thank you very much. One of the things I'm going to ask you to do is, I think on your way to your seat, is to share a copy of your book with some of our distinguished guests. So at this juncture, we're going to invite you to do just that, starting with the Governor General. So our colleague will assist you, and then we're going to turn to the final segment, which is the book award. So please, let's put our hands together again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.